Okay, and it's being live streamed as well. Thank you, Maxime, for helping us out. So welcome to the first Belgian virtual chapter meeting after the summer break. So we have with us Andrew van der Stok, who is going to explain us about the new OWASP Top 10 version 2021. Definitely we'll cover that. Before that, I also want to point out that we have a couple of upcoming events. If you're seeing this, so in October we have Steve Springett on component analysis. So that will be a very interesting talk as well, and virtual event as well. And then in November we have normally in person. So I really would like to welcome you to our OWASP Benelux event, which is going to be in the Netherlands, but more on that later on. If you want to stay informed, make sure to follow us on all channels possible. If you want to receive notifications of upcoming YouTube sessions, subscribe and notice or click the bell to get notifications. But with that, I'll first introduce Andrew. Andrew, I think you're with OWASP like for eternity. I think you were like you were actually one of the guys who started it. Well, at least you'll explain that to us. At least for me, you are one of the early starters. I think we encountered each other in the first time around 2005 in the first AppSec Europe conference, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, it's a very long time ago.
Yeah, I went to the Leuven one, which is 2006.
Yes, indeed. And I joined. Well, I joined the first one in London, where Jeff Williams asked for chapter meetings, chapter leaders to start local chapters, and I did that, and then we got you in Leuven. So, but yeah, Andrew has done an enormous lot, both in terms of content. I don't read the guide, the top 10, SVS, and probably a lot of other stuff. Also been very instrumental for organization in growing it to the organization as we are now. And I think also great to have you on board as our executive director for already more than a year. So with that, Andrew, the floor is yours. And for you who are listening live, there will be room for Q&A at around the half-hour mark. So, but let's have Andrew introduce us to the new OWASP Top 10. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Now, have I got the right screen? Can everybody see the PowerPoint and not the presenter? Okay, good.
You're totally fine.
Fantastic. Yeah, so just really quickly, I was not at the very beginning. I came in November of 2001, so about 2 or 3 months afterwards. But I have been around for a very long time, as folks have said. Okay, so this is more or less a trial version of the talk that I'm going to be giving at the 20th anniversary. So please do come to the 20th anniversary. We've got over 4,000 registrations as it stands. It's free, and there's various tracks, including a project track. Do come and register. It goes over 24 hours. So there's something for everybody in every single time zone. And one of our keynotes is actually Mark Curphey, who's one of our founders. It'd be very, very lovely for you to all come to that. I know that it's a lot of ask to come to a 24-hour session, but, you know, just pop in and out. Do come and see my talk, come and see Brian's talk. We'll talk about that in a tick. So what is the OWASP Top 10? I think most people are aware of it. The OWASP Top 10 is literally a top 10 risks. We often get asked the question, why are you not ordering by the biggest breaches? Or why are you not organizing it via the most number of CVEs? Or why aren't you organizing it? The reality is that it's partly composite from data, and we'll talk about the data in a little bit, but it's also partially about the impact. And one of those problems that we've got is that we have to come up with the idea of this impact for the universal application. And that's not true for everybody. For example, if you're using Microsoft SharePoint as a health CMS, that's a very different thing than if you're using Microsoft SharePoint for, say, for example, financial results. The impact is very, very different for those two things. So we make an educated guess as to where things are going. Now, The other thing is that this is the 7th update. We are about a year late, and that's due to COVID. We made the very difficult decision about halfway through last year that we weren't going to be able to do it in 2020 because we just hadn't had enough data. In the end, we actually did make the right decision here. Not only did we allow ourselves the opportunity to release at the 20th anniversary of OWASP, which is good, it also allows us to gather more data. And in the end, we gathered a lot more data. The OWASP Top 10 2017 had about 113,000 applications worth of data. We now have 515,000 applications worth of data. It covers the period from 2018 through 2021. And therefore, if you disagree with what we're saying here, you either need to have a better data analysis, which is exactly how Brian Glass became a co-leader, or you have more data than us, and I'm not aware of a bigger data set than ours. So let's get on with it. The audience of the OWASP Top 10 is developers, lead developers, and architects. It is an awareness piece. It is not a standard. That said, we do have some extra stuff for this time around. We'll talk about that in a tick. We're also looking at framework developers. Framework developers have a special responsibility in my view. Developers are relying upon them to get the security defaults right and everything like that. If we have seen, and you'll see in the new top 10, that cross-site scripting is no longer a separate entity or a separate category in the OWASP Top 10. We had to shove it into injections. And even after we did that, it is no longer number one. So just hold on to your hats. There's a reason why. And it's because framework developers are doing the right thing. It's now reasonably hard, or it's harder to do the insecure thing than it is to do the secure thing. And that's why we're actually aiming at a little bit at framework developers. Obviously, AppSec program management, and of course, AppSec professionals. To my mind, the OWASP Top 10, no matter the order, and we'll talk about ordering in a bit, is the bare minimum to avoid negligence. If you are doing penetration testing, code reviews, or even just a very cursory glance, and you're not using the OWASP Top 10 as that baseline, then it's probably that you're not meeting the minimum. That said, the ASVS is by far the better choice, and we'll talk about that as we go through. So the leadership is Brian, Torsten, Neil, and myself. I must say that it's sort of funny. Torsten is from Germany. He lives in Munich. He is one of our strongest English editors in terms of grammar and the way that it gets translated. Even though my name is Van der Stok and my family comes from just outside of Antwerp, I don't speak a word of Flemish. And so I do feel very bad about that. I wish I could speak more than one language, but I don't. So it's really good to have translators, and we'll talk about translators towards the end. We do have a new look, and in fact, you can start seeing some of it at the top right. We have a new look for after a decade. We had the original 2010 version of the PowerPoint, which Dave Wickers created. So for those who are unaware, the first version of the OWASP Top 10 was created by Dave and Jeff Williams of Aspect Security at the time in 2003, based around the data that they had from their consultancy. And it sort of stayed the same for many years because, well, they more or less guessed right based around the data they had. So we have updated that presentation look and feel now, and we've got new icons and new iconography. We're also going mobile first for the first time. The PDF will not be the master document, if you like. Mobile first is really important from our point of view. The cheat sheets, for example, are OWASP's most trafficked website because it is available on mobile. About 25% of the accesses on the cheat sheets are from mobile devices, whereas for the OWASP Top 10, although we get a lot of downloads of the PDF, only around 3% of the people accessing the OWASP Top 10 download are using it on mobile. And so that says to us that mobile first is incredibly important. And so we're actually using a Git book or a Make Docs type of document. We're also producing a PDF from that, and there will be a well-designed wall poster. We haven't finished that one yet. That is actually with Hugo, our graphic designer. That will be available within the month of release. And that's really good for people to have for the developers. You can actually get that printed off and give them, your developers, the OWASP Top 10 and what they should do about it and where to go. We have 4 new categories this time. including insecure design, which will be very controversial. I've seen plenty of comments about it, and we'll talk about what they might be, but also SSRF. And we've actually been very lucky to have Orange Tsai, one of the major researchers into SSRF. If you have not seen one of his talks before, please do so. Just look on YouTube, search Orange Tsai or SSRF. Most of the talks will be by him. He actually helped wrote the A10, which is the SSRF. And I thank him very much for that, because having that sort of expertise on the OWASP Top 10 is excellent. I love it. We also have included, I've been fighting the good fight to say that the OWASP Top 10 is not a standard for the better part of 15 years. And people use it as a standard. Most notably, PCI DSS used it as a standard for a long time. It is not a standard. It's very difficult to say that you've actually achieved compliance with it, because there are just so many CWEs. But also people have been using it as the basis of a very entry-level AppSec program. But because there was no guidance around it, we never made it clear that that was the very bare minimum to avoid negligence. So we've written a couple of chapters there, one on how to use it as a pseudo standard and where to go from there, but also how to actually adopt it as a basic AppSec program using the paved road concept, and we'll talk about that. Lastly, there's always some items that are just on the cusp, and so we've selected 4 that we're almost, if we didn't have, for example, the 2 community selected ones from interviews, they may have been included in the OWASP Top 10. And so we've included them in a very small description about what they are and what you can do about it. And we've got cheat sheet linkages so that if you are trying to do a bit more than just the top 10, you can. Where are we up to? Well, the data collection is done. The industry survey is done. The data analysis is done. The write-up is more or less done. We're actually reviewing it right now. We've got the GitHub issues to work through. And so that's my weekend coming up, is to knock some of those out. We actually have asked for people to start translating it, and I'm aware of Arabic and Chinese so far, and I believe Japanese is on its way, and Hungarian. So if you are interested in translating it to Flemish for whatever reason, or French. French is always a very popular download for us. Please come to the Slack channel for translations of the OWASP Top 10. I'll show you where that is later. Obviously, we have built the responsive web version, and I might show you that if we have time. But the PDF and the developer poster is literally going to come out after the actual release itself. The difference between the data analysis this time around and last time is we no longer constrain the CWEs that we were looking at. And no surprise, we got more than 700 rather than just 43. And that actually helped us a lot, because although it made our data analysis more difficult, the reality is it gave us more data. So we now have 515,000 worth, 515,000 worth of data, but we also have a lot more depth in that data, and we'll be making that data available very shortly, certainly by the time of the release. Now, we also had a survey that went out to Twitter, LinkedIn, and other places, and we had very many responses, and that helped us shape the 2 community selected ones. The OWASP Top 10, contrary to popular belief, is not completely data-driven. It's always had things shoved in it. For example, in the 2007 version, I shoved in CRSF, even though it didn't have any evidence for it, except for the fact that 100% of all applications at the time had CRSF. So don't ever think that the OWASP Top 10 is not opinionated. It is. It's not completely data-driven, and therefore, in some ways, people can complain about those choices. But we actually have a new process as of 2017 that we've reused this time around to get community feedback throughout the development process. This time, we've also done something slightly differently. We've normalized the way that we express the titles to be about root causes and not symptoms. For example, sensitive data exposure, which is a symptom, is actually broken access control. So that is actually A1 now. So if you're thinking about privacy and other access control issues, such as business logic flaws related to can so-and-so access this particular critical function, that is now number 1. And so sensitive data exposure in many ways went up from A3 to A1 but it also got a name change. And we're doing that deliberately. If you really want to have a AppSec program that is about a specific task or a specific CWE, you want the ASVS, you don't want the OWASP Top 10. Brian Glass at the 20th anniversary will be doing a data collection and analysis talk, which goes into this in much more depth and how we chose it and how we actually went and processed the actual OWASP Top 10 data. Okay, why is that not moving on? Okay. I've already talked about that. I probably will go on a little bit, but essentially it just goes on how to adopt as an AppSec program. We do talk about the paved road concept. This may not suit everybody, but the main thing is that we want to stop this idea that the AppSec team is better than and different to developers. That has not worked in the 25+ year history of our industry. Otherwise, the OWASP Top 10 wouldn't be necessary. I'm a huge proponent of the idea the AppSec team works with and helps developers, and then you can teach each other how to code and vice versa, how to code securely. Being part of the solution is way better than telling people that their baby is very ugly and they should throw it away. Okay, I'm over this idea that we're some sort of auditor. Unless you have an accounting degree specializing in auditing, you are not an auditor. Therefore, should we never, ever describe ourselves in those terms. It should be a protected profession, auditing, and we are not auditors for the most part. Now, that said, if you are an auditor, you're probably going to be doing SSAE 16 or other types of reviews, which are not really good for coding securely. So different things, different ideas. Obviously, we're giving up on the idea that you shouldn't use it as a standard. We're telling you how to use it as a standard. Primarily, it should be very clear to everybody that it is about the very bare minimum, and that's what we really care about. If you need to go further than this, we would encourage you to look at the ASVS. The ASVS itself can be forked, and then you can remove things you don't care about, and you can put things in level 1 that should be in level 1 for you. If you're doing penetration testing, for example, if there's something in the ASVS that cannot be pen tested, you can just remove it. So we encourage forking of the ASVS to make it suitable for your organization. We are aware with the ASVS that there are too many items in level 1 now. Version 5 is coming out next year. It will have much fewer items in level 1, and they will be based around the OWASP Top 10 data set, so that we can actually only ask you to look for things that are truly important based around what's actually found. So let's get into the OWASP Top 10. A01:2021. I know that's a mouthful, but because things change so much and there's a different mapping, we needed to make it very clear as to the year, but also how we actually express ourselves. It coalesces things together that are about sensitive data exposure, but it's also about access control. These are the basic access control flaws. This is a photo from Bruce Shiner's blog of about 2007. I love it because the actual barrier, which is the access control mechanism, is present, but it's totally ineffective because people can just drive around it. That's exactly what we want you to think about in A1. And in terms of privacy and regulatory impacts, but also it is responsible for some of the largest breaches. If you look at a lot of the database type sites, you'll see a lot of this stuff relates to this item. It is found in 3.2% of apps. It occurred 318,000 times. What I mean by occurred is people looked for it 318,000 times out of the 515,000 times. And so we do see a lot of CVEs, over 19,000 related to this issue. So it by far, it deserves to be number 1. Not only for its impact, but also for the fact that it affects humans in a very direct way. I'm not a huge believer in, oh, you can cause an access control failure and you can see the configuration of the server. Well, unless that actually causes a real problem for people, I don't care. I just don't. Number 2, cryptographic failures. Now, this is a bundling of 29 CWEs, and that's how we had to get this to work this time. Fundamentally, it's actually really hard to get. If we had data that only represented 1 CWE, we'd be talking about apps that, the occurrence would only be in 0.1% of an app. And that's not good enough for the OWASP top 10. We needed to bundle them together. So because we got so many, like 700 plus CWEs, we bundled them together and created a category for them. In this case, cryptographic failures. But it's also about hard-coded passwords. It's also about making sure that you've got correct TLS and configuration for the TLS so that you can't access it without going through a TLS connection. Or if you do, nothing sensitive is sent unencrypted, such as session tokens or cookies. So what we're also looking at is data at rest controls. So if you've got regulated data, like health data, it's not stored unencrypted. And if you are doing things like password storage, they are done correctly. So that's what this one's about. Injection is number 3 for the first time since 2003. It's not number 1. And to get it up to number 3, we actually had to put cross-site scripting in it and JavaScript injection. So a lot of the time, in the last couple of top 10s, we actually had arguments as to whether or not cross-site scripting is just simply a form of injection, because it is. The pattern is essentially user-controlled data is submitted and interpreted by some sort of interpreter as code, and that is injection. And therefore, by that definition, cross-site scripting and JavaScript injection and all the others like SQL injection, LDAP injection and whatnot, OGNL injection, even though it's incredibly rare, all of those things are just injections and therefore should be bundled together. This time we had to do it just simply to make sure that injections appeared in the top 10 at all. So this is primarily a really good result. It actually shows the OWASP top 10 has had an impact, and that's fantastic. The primary reason for this actually is because the framework developers like React and Vue, it's really hard to have cross-site scripting unless you go back and use the old way. So if you've got old code that's not quite fully migrated to React or Vue, you might still have cross-site scripting, but if you use React or Vue properly, you're not going to have it, and that's fantastic. And also it's simpler because you don't have to think about the encoding mechanism. React or Vue does that for you automatically. It is far simpler and faster for developers to use those frameworks. And so frameworks are the correct solution for almost all of the OWASP top 10. And we do encourage frameworks to look at how they can improve their compliance with it. Obviously, it's still discoverable. We do see it a lot in the tools, in the actual the data set that we have. It's still important to pay attention to. Just because it's number 3 doesn't mean you don't look for it. You should be looking for all 10 equally. These are the 10 worst things, not the only 10 things. Insecure design is a broad bucket. There's 40 CWEs involved in this, but it is not a catch-all bucket. It's not something you can just toss, oh, that looks bad. I don't know how to find another top 10 category. I'm just going to toss it into this one. It's not a catch-all bucket. It's designed to actually be about, for example, insecure password resets. If someone has questions and answers, there is no way to make that secure. It's just not possible to make it secure. It is an insecure design. Now, I'm picking on that one because it's an obvious one that most people are familiar with, but it's an example of where people didn't think through the design of the application, and it's possible to bypass the design because there are fundamental flaws in the actual design itself. So have a look at it. It is obviously somewhat controversial because many tools cannot design this, cannot test for it, and cannot find it. So the way that you would do this as a penetration tester is to actually use threat modeling yourself and actually work out what would happen if, and then do a test to see whether or not that actually is possible. So although this one is much harder to test automatically, it's something that should be done during the design of the application or during retrofitting of a new feature, is that the application designers and the developers should be doing threat modeling themselves in concert with an AppSec professional, and then tests, unit tests, integration tests, and obviously dynamic and other tests should be also built in to test that the design is actually in place and effective. That's what this one's about. Security misconfiguration is pretty much the same as we saw before. And because people are now using CI/CD tools to discover this much more frequently, and people like GitHub and whatnot have GitHub Actions that automatically discover these things, if you've ever received a Dependabot alert, that's an example of a CI/CD tool that surfaces some of the risks that we may not have been aware about. It moved up, and that's great. It's still a problem in that nothing in this area often ends up with a major breach, but together you can actually then build up and have a bigger breach. For example, if you've got an S3 bucket that's exposed and it's not easy to find, is that actually a problem? Well, yes, it is, because it can be used as a stepping stone for other things. So what we would like you to do is have a look at this one. The way for our teams to get around this and fix it is to use pre-built components that are optimized by a combination of the development team, the DevSecOps team, and the AppSec professionals, so that, for example, you have these golden AMIs, or you have servers that are pre-hardened, both for development and also production, that when you adopt them, it is the easiest and fastest way to get a secure outcome. It's also easier and faster than doing it the hard way or the insecure way. So that's why we've actually encouraged this paved road concept. Vulnerable and outdated components. We obviously, there's only 3 CWEs, and they are self-referential to the OWASP top 10, which is really unusual. It sort of demonstrates why the CWE, the weakness, is actually really hard to map this category. The other thing is that because this is about specific instances of an application, there are no CVEs at all for this. So it is actually found in 8.8% of apps. It is extraordinarily easy to discover and resolve this. If you've ever received a Dependabot alert, you've already had this, a tool telling you that you've got a problem. What I would like to do is what we told you to do in the ASVS 2.0 back in about a decade ago, and what we do in the 2017 one. If you've got this tool, like, for example, Dependency Tracker or Dependency Check or Cyclone DX or whatever the case may be, if you have an outdated component, you should absolutely be warning the developers that there is a problem and you need to deal with it, so they've got time to get this fixed. And then if they've got a vulnerable component, it just doesn't let you deploy it. The idea of deploying absolutely vulnerable apps by default straight into production, that's just crazy talk to me. That's like building a bridge that's already got cracks in it that will fall down eventually. People don't accept that. We should never accept vulnerable components being built into production. I encourage you to include some form of dependency checker in your CI/CD toolchain or as part of your build process, so that vulnerable components never make it into production. This is a very easy one to avoid. I want to see this one disappear from the 2024 or whatever the next version of the OWASP top 10 is. Identification authentication failures. It was actually strange to us that this was so low, but the data is what the data said. So people are obviously adopting multi-factor authentication, getting rid of insecure questions and things like that. There are 22 CWEs for this. It really does cover most of the ASVS V2 and V3. So if you are trying to fix this stuff up, just have a look at the ASVS V2 and V3, particularly at level 1. That is aligned with NIST 800-63. Add MFA to everything. There's no excuse these days. Make sure you've got some sort of password check, either develop it in-house yourself with a list. There's heaps of password lists out there, such as Daniel Messier's payloads. There's no excuse to allow people to reuse breached passwords today. And we can make this a much stronger solution if you actually have a shared authentication service or rely upon someone else's that has MFA turned on. Okay, we've got the critical data, software and data integrity failures is a new category. This one has 10 CWEs, but essentially it's around software updates that can be abused. It's about data that can be changed. So say, for example, if you've got some sort of JSON object that's been sent to the user and there's hidden fields in there that you can actually then modify. This is an old problem in new ways, but fundamentally what we're trying to do is looking for areas where the actual application itself can be violated because of poor data integrity controls. What we're looking for is, like with JWT tokens, some sort of integrity check to prevent tampering. Even if you can read it, you shouldn't be able to change it, those sorts of things. But also, how do we actually say that this is a real build? This is a real problem for folks who work with Node.js. Anybody who does Hello World ends up bringing in like 1,200 packages. How do you make sure that all those 1,200 packages are actually secure, even if you don't ever call them? That's actually a problem and something you should be looking at as part of this new category. We don't have all the answers. This is obviously a new one, but the actual pattern, we describe it, and therefore, every app might be slightly different. You may not have a software update mechanism. You may not have your JavaScript being included from a CDN. Have a look at how it might apply to you and see what you can do. Excuse me. I'll just... Okay. The old chestnut from last one. Considering the pushback that we had in 2017, including this one, because you can only really ask people to tell you, did you detect me from a penetration testing point of view? And you're only going to be able to find out for sure if you actually get a sampling of the logs that were generated and they actually did something about them. I was actually reasonably happy to see this one re-included as the top survey item. Anybody who's ever read a Verizon data breach report will know that it used to be more than a year for people to be breached. And then usually someone else would tell them about that breach. They couldn't detect it for themselves. What this is trying to do is set it up so that that becomes hours, if not days, rather than years. If you can't detect that you've been breached and then invoke some sort of response around that, then this is one of those areas that we really want you to fix up. Now, one CWE, again, it talks about the OWASP Top 10 2017. There is no other CWE for this. This is essentially one of those areas where the CWE is probably the wrong thing. What we're actually looking at the moment is actually a thing called CRE, and Torsten is actually working on a thing called OSIB. But fundamentally, we're looking at it from the point of view of requirements. How do we map requirements across different standards and keep a stable look and feel? So we've got people in OWASP who are actually really interested in CRE. Google's interested in working on it as well. I think this is a really good idea to allow standards. People have to apply multiple standards and adhere to them. If we had a mapping that said the OWASP Top 10 covers this one, that's also in ISO 27002, which is also in, say, for example, NIST or the US cybersecurity framework, that is really powerful. So I think CRE and OSIB have a future, but it's sort of disappointing that CWEs, there's only one of them and it's about the OWASP Top 10 2017. But anyway, getting towards the end here. The last one is SSRF. Obviously, this one was asked for by the community. And in many cases, if you've done the work to fix up XXC, SSRF wouldn't be unusual to you, but it's actually a bunch more things. So it's essentially, you might be able to get a URL into the application in some way, either through an XML document or just entering a URL of some description, and then it allows you to do various things. Again, if you're interested in how this is important or why this is important, have a look at some of the YouTube videos from Orange to Sai. His Black Hat talks on the topic are excellent. He shows you how he took over, I believe, GitLab through SSRF in one of them. And so this is actually not a vague hand-wavy type of problem. This is a real problem that you should be very much aware of. We are looking for IDEs and frameworks to highlight where there is a potential for SSRF to come in. A lot of SSRF comes from the way that different frameworks interpret URLs differently. So if you're doing that, then you need to be aware that user-supplied input can be hostile, and it might end up being about SSRF. And so what do you do about it? Well, network segmentation is still a thing. We encourage people to isolate applications from each other. It's much easier to do that in the cloud than it is on-prem, but fundamentally, there's a lot of different controls you can apply. So have a look at that one. Orange Society wrote it. I think it's excellent advice. Give it a go. So the OWASP Top 10 has always had things that didn't quite get in. We had a lot of pushback in 2017 when CRSF dropped off. It was in the next few, and we did highlight that in the what we call the AR section of the 2017 version. This time we've called it A11. It's not part of the OWASP Top 10 officially, and there's only really 4 small paragraphs of comment about it, and it links off to cheat sheets, so you can learn about how to avoid those things. I was surprised to see memory management errors creep in here, but obviously people are getting back to using systems languages for web app development, and although Go and Rust are designed to be memory safe, it is still possible because they're systems languages to do the wrong thing. And we're starting to see a creep up in the number of issues again. So do have a look at it. Okay, we want bug classes fixed. I think a lot of these things are, if you look at the OWASP Top 10 as a category, from any of them, like injections, that's a bug class. If we can work on eliminating bug classes, you can make a really big difference to the way that the world works. Imagine if we never made progress on getting SQL injection dealt with after 20 odd years. To my mind, we really should be having that impact. How do we help framework and developers use frameworks that are more secure? We do want to have a whole bunch of other ones that we're bringing in. There is heavy interlinking, which we're still working on at the moment, to the proactive controls, the ASVS, and the cheat sheets. And we want people to be able to get the basic information from the OWASP Top 10, but then learn what they can do about it in much more concrete details in their preferred language somewhere else. I also want to highlight the work the Education and Training Committee, they are working on developing a curriculum and framework for developer training. There's also a current effort on to do some certification that's being potentially funded by a large consulting firm. That's in earlier stages. If you're interested in working on the curriculum or a certification, please drop into the Education and Training Committee and give them a hand. They really need it. It's moving much slower than I expected. The more hands, the better it'll be. So how do you get involved? Well, we're still in the basis of doing reviews. I really want you to pull it up, go there, log issues. You can actually tell us things that are problems, but also things that you philosophically don't like, and that's fine. But fundamentally, we want to make sure that we get the balance from the community in these last few days before we release it at the 20th anniversary. If you are interested in doing translations, pop into the Top 10 translations channel and just say what language you're interested in translating it to. Then someone may already be working on it and could probably use some help. It's much easier to translate than the previous versions because you don't have to produce 2 versions. There's only one, it's in Markdown. So with that, questions?
We have a question from Magno Logan in the Zoom chat. Are there any plans to release a new version of the proactive controls? Also, how does an organization provide data to OWASP?
Okay, so that's a really good question. First things first, the proactive controls are looking to align themselves with the OWASP Top 10 2021. Jim and Katie have actually said that they're interested in updating. I think there will probably be a new version in the new year, I'm not sure. How do you submit data? Well, we do a data call. There is an OWASP Top 10 Twitter, and we also announce it on LinkedIn, and that's retweeted several times. So we had the data call open for nearly a year. We had a large number of submissions. So if you are interested in helping, just make it easy on yourself. If you don't have some sort of tool to collect the information, what we're really looking for is, what was the CWE you found? Was it a real first test or a retest? Because we don't want to double count things. Like if you've tested an application 300 times using a static code analysis tool, you'll swamp real data. We want to know whether it was a real test or a retest. And then secondly, we want to know how many times did you find it? So for example, an application done by a static code analysis check, you may have found 3,000 cross-site scripting. Tell us that information. If you're doing a penetration test, was it systemic or was it something that you found 8 or 9 times? So because we actually distinguish between tool-assisted humans and human assisted by tools and just raw tools, we can actually weight those different answers. So yeah, go for it.
Okay, there's another question from Eric in the Zoom chat here. Are there any plans to issue top 10s with a faster frequency? 5 years is a long time in the web industry.
Correct. And if it wasn't for COVID, it would have been out last year. We're trying to do it every 3 years. That has been the frequency before 2021. But there is an opportunity here for us to actually do a 20th anniversary one in 2023, which is a little bit soon for us. But I do see the opportunity there to actually update it in 2023. At worst, it'll be 2024. Our frequency has been 3 years at this point.
Yep. So I don't see any other questions. So if you're in the Zoom call, just really post your question in the chat window. If you're in the live view of YouTube, just post it there in the chat. We'll relay the question. Maybe a question from my side. I think there's lots of, I would say, questions on the insecure design. Can you re-explain really why that one's in there and why it actually is also like in the top 4 and not in another location?
Yeah, so let me bring it up. It might be worthwhile for people to actually see it. Okay, so this is the new format. It will look prettier. We've got, as I said, new graphics coming in very shortly. Translations are now standard, and you can get to the actual source of it really quite quickly. Let's just go to the insecure design. And so essentially it does have some CWEs, which are very familiar for many people, but it's also, because there's so many of them, there's 40 of them, it's a broad category representing many different weaknesses expressed as missing or ineffective control design. So effectively, if you're looking at an application and you were able to bypass something because of the design of that application, this is where it gets bundled in. But have a look at the CWEs that we actually do have. We do provide the list of mapped CWEs. So for example, request smuggling is here, unprotected storage of credentials, improper handling of extra parameters, which is, essentially that thing that we talked about before with JSON objects coming in, parameter pollution, and, essentially where we would like for people to have a look at these things. If you come across these CWEs in your tools, in your reviews, that's where this one comes in. Okay. So there's plenty of things in here that could actually be considered design, where the lack of a control, or if the control is present and it doesn't work very well, then that's where this gets bundled. Now, we had a lot of arguments within the actual team itself on this category, but it was difficult to justify not including it. So in the end, what we would like to do is we're going to have a cheat sheet built. We're writing that at the moment, which will actually talk about secure design principles, about how to do basic threat modeling and how to avoid many of these things. We'll pick up the data. So let me just go to OneDrive. And as I said, the data does exist and we will be getting it out there for people. So when we did the bundling, this is how we did it. We essentially did talk about a bunch of different ways and how the methodology worked and things like that. But there is actually a lot of data about the CWEs and how we actually categorize them together. So say, for example, in the top 10 here, we have let's go for unprotected CWE 256. So we go to that one and then search for it in here. It's probably not on the screen yet. I bet if I did this in Excel, it would actually show up. But the amount of frequency, you can actually see that we didn't get a lot of data out of any particular CWE. And so therefore, it's really important to us to make sure that we don't go out of our way to get you to do things that may only occur 5 times out of 515,000 apps. That's crazy talk. So the cheat sheet will talk about the ones that have like 5,000 occurrences, not the ones with 5. And that's how we're going to prioritize the development of that. It won't be as hard as people think to bundle these things up, but we will be making sure that the advice that we give is prioritized based on frequency of occurrence.
All right, thank you.
So I just want to highlight the fact that we do work in the number of issues has gone up dramatically. As I said, my weekend is going to be basically getting through all of these things, allocating tasks, and then doing stuff. And you can see here we've got a translation into Arabic, and we do encourage people to provide that via a pull request. Pull requests are very much appreciated because we can easily go into them and have a look and say, yes, that is definitely an error that needs to be resolved, and we can fix that and easily do it. I love those sorts of fixes because they're very pragmatic and easily resolved.
Yes, yes. And I would indeed encourage everyone to do it like that, also for the other projects. And we have another question here from Eric in the chat. In many organizations, security asks for developers to protect against the OWASP top 10. Wouldn't it be a better requirement to ask for the top 10 proactive controls to be implemented?
Yes, very much so. And in fact, that's what we actually talk about. Let me just go back to the top 10. Where is it? And how to use an AppSec program. Honestly, we encourage you to use OpenSAM. We encourage you to use the proactive controls, and we also encourage you to actually use the ASVS. The proactive controls team are working with the data that we have, and they will be producing an update soon. If you feel that in our comments here that we don't bring up the ASVS or the proactive controls enough, please let us know and we'll add more, because proactive controls is the correct thing for developers.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I would also say that instead of security asking the developers to fix it, to reconsider a little bit the position of security and to see how together you can set up a program in the overall, as an overall program. And Sam, yes, that definitely would be a good starting point, but I'm biased there. Okay, well, we have a couple of other questions. So we have a question from Ricardo. I would love to see the list of threat prevention best practices. So it could be shared with developers, how to be notified about the white paper being available. The last one, that's not clear, but I think it's probably referring to a link that you already had on there.
Yeah, so what we're trying to do here is we're trying to link to the proactive controls, but also cheat sheets. And the cheat sheets actually do talk about exactly that. So what we do, we refer you to, for example, the transport layer protection, and this is updated all the time. The advice is improved over time. And so that's really important to us, is that we don't wait 3 years for the cheat sheet to get better. What we do say is that the data for standards needs to move a little slower, because it's very hard for people who have multi-year programs to adopt a moving target that changes all the time. So what we do encourage people to do is look at the cheat sheets, have a look at HSTS, for example, although that one's starting to become a little less useful, but also how to use the ASVS and proactive controls in this one, like how to protect data everywhere. So that one is actually covered off by our references. If there's anything that you think about direct, please review it. If you think we don't make that clear enough in our recommendations, please do let us know, and we can tune that before we release.
Yeah, a couple of other questions in the Q&A, especially specifically one about the Excel one that you showed. Is that something that's going to be shared as well, or is that
Yes.
available?
Yes, it will be. The problem we've got is that some of our data contributors ask for it to be a bit private. So we're just going to sanitize the data a little bit to make it harder to actually figure out where it came from. But as soon as we've done that, it's out there and everybody can have this data. As you can see, we actually had multiple versions of the top 10 model ourselves. So if you wanted to see where we ended up in our models versus what we actually chose, like the B model is one that didn't get through, but that actually had injections number 2. So even ourselves, we actually had discussions about where things ended up. It's not something that we just dream up one day and say, oh, let's stir things up.
You'll have to make a presentation, the making of OWASP 10.
That is actually at the 20th anniversary. Brian Glass is presenting it. If you're interested, please attend his talk.
Definitely. Then there's a question also from, what about XXE, the XML external entity processing? Is that integrated into injection?
It is covered in one of the things here. I don't think we've got a search function. I will try to get an index created before we release so that we can actually do that. But XXE is actually definitely covered off in one of these.
Okay. All right.
I can definitely highlight that in one of them. I don't know where it is.
I'm looking at the live stream. Any questions? No.
Oh, there's one about DevOps, DevSecOps. Yeah, so misconfiguration is probably the most obvious one, but also have a look at the AppSec program. We talked about paved road. DevOps, to my mind, DevSecOps should be looking at how do we actually get components into the hands that are built securely, and as a DevSecOps team, continue to update them. But also, one of the things that I noticed when I was doing research for this is that even if the DevSecOps teams updates these components, you can't just apply them. You actually do need to work with development teams to make sure that they adopt them. So how do you notify them? In large organizations, this is a real challenge. And in fact, that was one of the highlights of one of the talks that I watched when I did this paved road stuff, is just how difficult it is to say, yes, I've got this wonderful brand new golden AMI. It's fantastic. You should absolutely use it. But then identifying which teams would actually benefit from this AMI, or did they use a previous version? How do you actually know? So surfacing metrics to your development teams about things that they could adopt easily and then improve their security as a result. That's actually this section. So do read that section, and obviously vulnerable and outdated components is very interesting. If you're responsible for CI/CD, adding in the tools to identify and surface risk to the development teams on a real-time basis is also a really good positive outcome.
Right. So, and if there's no other questions, then let's.
Calendar. We scheduled a WASP grant.
Sorry, that's my Alexa telling me about my next meeting.
There you go. Indeed, right in time.
So, your next 4 events are.
Screen then, and so thank you very much, Andrew. And I would say kudos to the whole team. This has been a huge job, but it's great that to see the OWASP 10 in its latest release. So anyone, indeed, they are more than encouraged to join the 20th anniversary session next week. And then here locally in Belgium, well, at least we'll have a virtual one next month with Steve on component analysis, and then in November we'll have the OWASP Benelux. If you liked what you've seen, make sure to subscribe to our channel, and also obviously register to our meetup group. You'll be notified whenever we have any upcoming sessions. And with that, thank you for your participation, and see you at the next event. Bye-bye. Thanks, Andrew.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thank you. Bye.